Today is June 4th, 2021. My name is Leah Cohen. I'm the Oral History and Reference Manager at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. On behalf of PMML, I'm honored to interview Major General John Scully. General Scully served not only on active duty, but also in the reserves, not only in the home front, but also in Vietnam. I know that I've certainly learned by reading about your background how essential logistics is to the military for so many reasons. So we thank you very much for coming in today virtually, and we look forward to hearing your story. So we'll begin at the beginning. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1943. I was actually born in a hospital that doesn't exist anymore. I forget the name of it, but I was born in Chicago and grew up in Chicago, Elmwood Park, Illinois, and Westchester, Illinois.
So what was it like growing up in these three different places?
Well, my father was an electrician worked for Illinois Bell Telephone Company. He installed telephones for 50 years back in the day when telephones were black and they were dial and they went on somebody's desk. I went to Catholic grade school, mostly in Divine Infant in Westchester, Illinois. Graduated from 8th grade in 1956 and went to Fenwick High School in Oak Park, Illinois. Had a good experience in high school. I was in the marching band. I played the clarinet, and that was basically my main activity at Fenwick. I majored in political science and graduated in 1960 and entered the University of Notre Dame in September of 1960.
Did you have any?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Did you have any brothers or sisters?
I had a younger brother who was 5 years younger than me. He was born in 1948. He also attended Fenwick, and he played on the 1966 Catholic League Championship team. Unfortunately, James passed away at the age of 44 many years ago. So he hasn't been around for, well, probably 25 years. So,
was your father or any other relatives in the military?
My dad was not. I was born in 43, so the war was going on. But I had an uncle, Martin Rainey. Uncle Marty was in the Navy in World War I. And I had another Uncle Harry who served in the Pacific in World War II. Harry was a tech sergeant. He brought home a piece of Tojo's cloth, a piece of it had blood on it. I'm not quite sure what he did and how he got Tojo's cloth, but he was involved in the capture of Tojo. And Harry and Marty were both very proud of their military service, Marty in the Navy and Harry in the Army. Harry went on to become the personnel director of the Chicago Park District. And he had an influence in that he was always proud of his military service.
Interesting. Did you talk to him about it a lot?
Not really. I was a young boy, and no, we really never really talked about his military service. I just knew that he was in the service. I knew that somehow in the course of time, Tojo's cloth came down into the family. I don't even know where it's at today, but I remember that story. And I do have pictures of Harry and Marty in their military uniforms.
And what did you study at the University of Notre Dame?
Okay, I studied English literature at Notre Dame. Much to my parents' chagrin, they thought I should have been in the business school. But I studied English. I enjoyed it. Back in those days, Notre Dame was an all-male school, and English appealed to me. And so I studied English, and when I graduated, I went on and pursued a master's degree in English literature as well. So,
how did it come about that you joined the ROTC?
Okay, I joined ROTC when you were a freshman at Notre Dame back in 1960. You had two choices. You could either be an ROTC or you could go to physical education. And I really wasn't much into physical education or that kind of stuff. I wasn't in sports. And the ROTC seemed like an interesting alternative. And probably back then, if there were 6,000 students at Notre Dame, probably half of them, maybe 1,500, were in ROTC, freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. And so I was able, because of my band experience at Fenwick, I was asked to join the ROTC band, which is kind of funny, but it was enjoyable. We did the marching, and we were the ones that played the music when the troops passed in review. I also found that you had to take one or two courses a year in military history, which were taught by sergeants and captains in the ROTC program. And it kind of complemented my English study of English literature. And I enjoyed studying military history. And so I stayed at ROTC at Notre Dame. After my sophomore year, I had to make a decision. Did I want to stay? And remember, I came from a family that we didn't have a lot of money. And believe it or not, I got $27.35 a month for being in Army ROTC as a junior and senior. And it's hard to say that you enjoyed something, but I found it to be very interesting. Did not wear my uniform on campus a lot. My dormitory was right next to the ROTC building, so I'd run to ROTC at the first class of the day, come back in my room, take my uniform off, and then go to class for the rest of the day.
Balance both.
Yeah.
Did you choose to study at Notre Dame because it was in alignment with your faith or your practice as a Catholic?
I chose to study at Notre Dame for a couple of reasons. I had applied, first of all, it was a Catholic school, and so you're right. Notre Dame, I had applied to Notre Dame, St. Joseph's College in Rensselaer, Indiana, and John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio. Notre Dame, the family had a history. My mother's mother, my grandmother,
wow,
her cousin was one of the 7 mules that played with the 4 horsemen. His name was Chuck Collins. And Chuck was kind of somebody we idled. And so it seemed like a nice thing to do is to apply to Notre Dame and see if I got in. I was lucky enough that I got into Notre Dame. And fortunately, my father's mother, May Scully, worked for Sears Roebuck as a secretary. And when she passed away in the early 1950s, she left an estate of $300,000. Which, you think about it, back in the 50s, that's a lot of money.
Right.
And Dad got $150,000 of it, and that paid my $2,000. So people laugh at this, but my room, board, and tuition for 1 year at Notre Dame was $2,000.
Right.
Back in the 1960s. So that paid for my tuition at Notre Dame. So I went to college. Fortunately, when I graduated, I had no debt. And the ROTC money gave me good spending money. So it was a nice balance. I love Notre Dame. I still do to this day. I'm very active at the university.
Wow. And what was the ROTC summer program like, I believe, at Fort Riley, Kansas?
Yeah, when I went between your junior and senior year, you had to do I think at the time it was a 6-week summer camp, annual training. and it was at Fort Riley, Kansas. As I said earlier, I'm not very athletic, so I was probably last in my platoon and last in my company in just about everything, shooting a rifle, doing physical training. And it was kind of, the captain said to me, he said, cadet, I'm not sure that we are going to move you on. And then very fortunate, and the guys knew it. The guys in my platoon and squad knew it. And fortunately, we did a squad attack of a hill, and that's taking 8 guys and going up the side of a hill and taking the machine gun nest at the top. And I did it very successfully. And the captain looked at me and said, "You have leadership skills, son, and I think you should stay in the Army and ROTC." And so I did. He passed me on. I actually qualified for everything. I was able to shoot my rifle, but I was a marksman, was a sharpshooter, not a marksman. I was whatever the lowest medal was. That's me. And graduated and moved on to senior year. I was not a cadet officer. I was the cadet sergeant major in the band. And so as a result, I graduated in 1964 and was commissioned on June 7th, 1964. And my wife and my fiance at the time, who's now still my wife, and my mother pinned my bars on me.
How lovely. How lovely.
Yeah.
One thing that struck me was what you had written on the pre-interview questionnaire, that after doing the squadron attack practice, you realized the Army could be instrumental in developing my managerial skills. And I was wondering, was it innate that you had like an inclination to be able to organize and lead people?
I would say that I have a lot of common sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I know how to get things done through other people.
Yeah.
And probably back when I was 20 years old, I probably couldn't articulate that, but I felt that I could do things. When I worked for the Chicago Park District as a summer employee, I was in a civil engineer unit. We were the guys that went out and did the surveying. And the guy that ran the thing said, you know how to organize things. So would you take charge of this? Would you do that? When I entered the Army in January of 1968, I was in the Adjutant General Corps.
Mm-hmm.
And our branch was responsible for running such things as postal, personnel, human resources. And I was asked to run the Chicago Armed Forces Day Parade in 1968. And that was an organizational responsibility. I was responsible for getting the Army, the National Guard, and back in the 60s, we had Fifth Army headquarters here. We had the Navy at Great Lakes with a headquarters. We had the Air Force at O'Hare Air Force Base. And so my common sense and my organizational skills came to the fore.
Interesting.
And so as a result, I think that captain back at Fort Riley saw something that I probably didn't even know that I had.
Yeah.
A skill, but through doing things, I learned. So when I went to active duty, my first assignment was to help with the Armed Forces Day Parade here in Chicago.
Do you want to back up a little bit and just talk about basic training, where you were and what it was like, etc.? Okay,
basic training was hard. Fort Riley, Kansas, in the middle of summer. Kansas is not exactly the garden spot of America. It's hot. It's in the 90s. It's humid. We lived in old World War II barracks, and we had probably 30 guys on the floor, the first floor. The platoon sergeant lived on the second floor. He was a regular Army sergeant. I still remember his name. His name was Billy Boyd. And Billy Boyd was a staff sergeant. He basically taught us basic soldiering skills, map reading, use of the gas mask, how to fire your weapon, how to do squadron in the attack. So basic soldiering skills that any soldier would get when he went to basic training, or she today would go to basic training. Back then, there were no women in ROTC that I can remember. I mean, it just was not the thing in the 1960s. So basically, summer camp was basic soldiering skills. The nice thing was, it was, believe it or not, Monday through Friday, and they gave us Saturday and Sunday off, mainly because of the heat. And we'd all head to the Holiday Inn in Junction City, Kansas, to jump in the swimming pool and get some relaxation. Probably by today's standards, they'd say it was pretty candy work, but it wasn't. It was hard work. We lost a lot of weight. We built up our physical strength, and looking back on it, it was a good experience. I came away from that knowing that I had skills to be a leader. And as I say, I probably didn't, overtly think that, but it was there.
Is there. And was it an opportunity as well for you to meet people from different backgrounds, once you're in the Army itself?
Yeah, it was. The ROTC program was at Fort Riley at that time, was made up of students from Kansas, Nebraska, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin. I honestly don't remember. I don't remember any of their names. We didn't get to know each other that well. We were there together for 6 weeks. My buddy was with me from Notre Dame, and he and I were roommates when we went off to the Holiday Inn to relax. And his name, I'm trying to think Lenny's last name. I can remember his first name, but I don't remember his last name. So.
Okay. When did you go to Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indiana?
Sure. When I graduated from Notre Dame, I took a 1-year deferment, and I studied for a Master of Arts degree in English literature. My plan was to be a teacher. So in 1964, 65, I was going to graduate school at DePaul University here in Chicago. When I completed that master's degree, I entered the Army in January of 1967. And the purpose of going to Fort Benjamin Harrison was to study as the officer basic course for the Adjutant General Corps. And that was basically to teach you what the role of a lieutenant was and a captain, what your duties were in the adjutant, what's the role of the Adjutant General Corps. And basically it was human resources, it was postal, it was administrative work. And that was a 6-week course. In March of 67, March of 67, I was assigned to 5th U.S. Army headquarters in the Personnel Services Branch. Is that right? Yeah, 67. I believe it was 67.
Okay, so I'm a little unclear as to when you were detailed to work on the Armed Forces Week planning committee.
Sure. When I got to Fifth Army headquarters, they were looking for a brand new second lieutenant to assign that duty to. So I never really worked in personnel. When I got there, I was assigned to work full-time in the public affairs office. And the public affairs office had nothing to do with personnel. My job was to go to meetings with Mayor Daley. My job was to work with the 2 people that were in public affairs. to coordinate with the Army, Reserve, National Guard, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps to get the units together to march in this parade down. The parade was actually down State Street at the time.
Oh,
We set up static displays in what's now known as Daley Plaza. We were also responsible for running the Armed Forces Ball, which was a big deal. It was either at the Conrad Hilton Hotel or at the Palmer House, and they used to alternate. And it probably drew anywhere from 500 to 1,000 people. Remember, this is back in the time when the Vietnam War was going on. So my first assignment was in public affairs.
well, I was actually about to ask you about that. Like, considering the fact that we're starting to see the beginning of protests against the Vietnam War or other riots in Chicago, like the Division Street riots, did you have to take into account security concerns when coordinating the parade?
In 1967, you did not.
It's a year before.
It was before the riots.
Yeah.
So in 67, there was nothing going on that was going to interrupt with the parade. In fact, it was a big deal. I mean, police units marched, high school bands marched. It was a parade that probably lasted over 2 hours. And it was usually held on the week of it was Armed Forces Week. So in the 67, there were no protests here in Chicago. Frankly, Mayor Daley wouldn't allow it.
So was it so challenging dealing with all these different forces as well as the police to?
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. It was a big challenge.
Yeah.
I had help. I wasn't the only guy doing this, but it was an important, they would turn to me and say, now make sure we get this done, Lieutenant. And I would make sure it got done. I don't want to overplay this. I was part of a team of people, both sergeants, myself, and some civilian employees. My boss was actually a guy by the name of John Tamaraz, who was a retired Army major from public affairs. And Tamaraz kind of took me under his wing and was a mentor as to what was going on. So no, I was part of a team.
Part of a team and someone who was a mentor to you because of his experience. Yeah. I think you mentioned that this was one of your highlights working on. So I guess my question is, like, why was it a highlight?
Well, it was a highlight because jumping forward a few years, I returned to Chicago and worked at the Northern Trust Company, and I was known to the military community here in Chicago. Cool. So people knew who I was. So it was part of building the network that we all build. And as I say, it was a highlight because, I mean, I have a picture of myself and Mayor Daley. I mean, it was a big deal. And I have a picture of myself with, I don't know if you know who Major General Gibby Vartan is, but General Vartan's father was a very wealthy Chicagoan. And I got to know Mr. Vartan, and through knowing Mr. Vartan, I got to know Gibby Vartan, his son, they ran a printing company here in Chicago. So the network was starting to build. So that's why it was a highlight.
That's very, very cool. What was your next assignment? Was this at the 30th Base Post Office?
Okay, when I completed the assignment, I went back to the officer assignment branch, and in September of 1967, I came home with a telegram that had my name on it, and it said, "You are assigned to the 38th Base Post Office at Fort Riley, Kansas, and you are going to deploy to Vietnam." So we showed up at Fort Riley, Kansas, and frankly, so in January of 1968, and to think about it, back in 1968 in January, there was a 25-inch snowstorm that came in 2 days. And I had a Plymouth Valiant convertible.
Oh, God.
And I called the Army and said, I'm going to be late to Fort Riley. And said, no, you're not. You get yourself out here. We don't care about the snowstorm. And my wife and I got in that little Valiant and drove to Fort Riley, Kansas, made it. And this was really my first experience with the Army Reserve, because the 38th Base Post Office was in a file drawer in the Pentagon. So they pulled it out and said, this is a unit we're going to activate. So everybody in the unit, it was made up of reservists, both enlisted personnel, as well as the officers were all ROTC graduates. And the commander's name was Major George Stinger. And George Stinger was a master sergeant working in the Pentagon who happened to get a commission in the Korean War. And he was brought on active duty as a major. And I hate to say it, but Major Stinger was not the brightest light bulb on the chain. Unfortunately, the captains and the two captains and the 6 lieutenants, all of us together helped Major Stinger. If you remember the movie MASH,
Yeah.
Major Stinger was like the colonel in the movie MASH. He couldn't do anything right, but we all took care of him. So we activated a unit. The sergeants were all postal sergeants who ran postal units. It was a unit of about 60 people. The 38th Base Post Office, the role of the unit is to move bulk mail. So just think about a large centralized postal function. We moved to mail to the smaller APOs or to the smaller post offices. We also had a postal directory, which meant that we would take mail that was for wounded or dead soldiers, and we'd sort it so it would get to the right location. So if a guy was in a hospital in Hawaii, we'd sort the mail to there. My role when I in Fort Riley was again something that this major called me in and said, you're responsible for moving this unit from Fort Riley to Vietnam. You'll make sure that the equipment is packed on the trains. You'll help get the soldiers there. So I was in charge of the moving the unit. And this I was truly in charge. The cool thing about it was the unit went by boat. I got to fly on an airplane to Vietnam on Braniff International Airways. But that, again, that was my organizational skills. I said to the major, I said, I don't know anything about transportation. I don't know anything about it. He said, neither do I. So we'll learn together, but you're in charge. You're going to do this. And I did it. And so that was really the first leadership or organizational effort that I had.
It sounds like a huge organizational effort, but could you tell us a little bit about the mechanisms involved, like how you contacted railroad and if you worked with military rail versus civilian, et cetera?
The railroad, the Army has, at Fort Riley, Kansas, they have rail there. So you go down to the transportation office, you work with the transportation officer on the post. He works with you to bring the appropriate flat cars in, the appropriate box cars, to move the equipment from Fort Riley to Oakland Army Terminal. You also work with the transportation officer to get the soldiers, their equipment on trucks into the buses, because they bust them to Fort. They didn't take a train, you bust from Fort Riley to Oakland, California. So all of that was coordinated with me and the transport, but that was my first taste of the Transportation Corps, which I ended up, as you know, in the Transportation Corps. It was my first understanding of logistics. It was my responsibility to make sure that the manifest for the boat trip over, they left from California and they took a boat from California, or a ship from California. And I think they went into the port of Saigon.
So both the equipment and the men and everything went
on the boat, on the ship,
yeah.
On the ship. And my responsibility was to make sure all that happened. make sure all the manifests were done correctly. And it worked. We got there. I flew over, the ship took off, and then I flew over the next day and flew into, I think we flew into Cameron Bay.
Mm-hmm.
And go ahead.
What did your parents, and I think you were married at the time, and your wife think about you needing to go to Vietnam?
Well, she wasn't happy about it. We had just been married. She actually came with me to Fort Riley. So we had been married about 8-9 months when I left for Vietnam. I left for Vietnam in April of 1968. And she returned to Chicago, to Riverside, Illinois, where she lived with her parents and taught grade school in both Riverside and North Riverside. My parents were scared to death. My mother never wanted me to be in the military. And my mother was a very stern woman. She made no bones about it that she did not want me in the military. My wife understood. Her father happened to be a navigator in World War II for the Navy. So there was a history in her family of military service. In fact, I think most of her uncles served in the military. Mm-hmm. She's very supportive, but it was a scary time. You were going into a country that was difficult, and you know, there was not a lot of. This is where you started in '68, where you started the riots, and the civilian population of the United States did not support the war in Vietnam.
No. Yeah. So when you were deployed, was this with the intention that you would just establish the new postal base and then return home, or with the understanding that you would be based in Vietnam for a while?
Yeah, when I got to Vietnam, we were flown down from Cam Ranh Bay. We were flown down to Saigon, now called Ho Chi Minh City. And it was basically the base post office was there for 2 or 3 years. Back then, the president of the United States, who I think was Lyndon Johnson, did not want to activate the reserve components. So if you had a commitment, as I did, I had a 2-year commitment. So I knew that I was going to be in Vietnam until the end of my commitment, which was basically 7 months after I got there. And the post office, I believe, stayed there for 3 or 4 years. My job was, once I got there, was to take possession of the building where the post office was going to be. The post office was actually in a place called Camp Red Ball, which was the terminal point for a trucking Camp Red Ball. Red Ball Express was a truck convoy, and it was in a town called Go Vap, which was a suburb of Saigon. We had the post office there. We had our barracks there. We had a chapel there. We had a mess hall there. We had the personal effects depot for soldiers that were killed there. So that was a quartermaster unit. My postal unit, or the unit that I was responsible for managing, was at Thompson Hood Air Force Base. So I did not live at Camp Red Ball, but I made sure all the buildings were set up. So when the unit arrived by boat, they were trucked and they fell in and they started functioning as a post office. I went down to Thompson Hood Air Force Base, and I was responsible for the postal directory. I supervised 90 soldiers, and their job was to sort mail 7 days a week. And that was my first taste of supervision. Remember, I was in combat service support, so I never was in combat because I was in service support, which was a very important responsibility. But again, I was managing 90 guys.
And I believe you mentioned that some of them were 20 years older than you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, the sergeants were all in their 40s. They were career postal sergeants. They were E5s and E6s. But I was the lieutenant. So when I said go, by then I was a first lieutenant. So I had been promoted. I had been promoted before I left to the United States.
So how did you garner their respect?
Just because I was the lieutenant. Two, I had a lot of common sense. You learn very early on in the military that you rely on your first sergeant. If your first sergeant of the unit has respect for you and understands, and you understand what his role is, and he helps you understand your role, things work very smoothly.
Really?
I took care of the soldiers. I was there. I was with them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We worked 12-hour shifts, 12 on, 12 off. They knew I was around. They knew I had interest in them. And the young soldiers, you really kind of had to mentor, because some of them was the first time they'd been away from home.
Yeah.
And these were, the other thing is that the young soldier knew that if he caused trouble, he'd end up in an infantry unit and he wasn't going to have a nice job, because for Vietnam, it was a nice job.
Well, that's interesting, because I was wondering how the former reservists felt now that they're activated and deployed in Vietnam.
That's a tough question to answer. The young soldiers wanted to do their job, survive, and get out of there. I think we all did.
Yeah.
The one thing that bothered me, and still does to this day, is that we were fighting communism. The North Vietnamese were fighting a corrupt regime in Saigon that we supported, and they were fighting in a civil war. Yeah. In hindsight, in fact, when I was there, my goal was to get out of there. I mean, it was not to lose the number of soldiers that we did was heartbreaking, because we were supporting a regime that was just corrupt. Yeah. The North Vietnamese were dedicated to winning that war. It didn't matter to them whether it was French or American. They were going to win that war, and they were going to stay there until they won it. So from John Scully's point of view, it was not a war that I was 100% behind. However, you take an oath of office as an officer and as an enlisted person to support and defend the Constitution and to obey the officers assigned above me. Yeah. And so I had an oath that I had taken at Notre Dame, and I was going to fulfill that oath. So I don't know if I answered your question the way you expected, but it was a difficult time. In the meantime, in August of '68, you had the riots going here. You had Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King was murdered. So it was a tumultuous time in the United States.
Were you receiving news from the Stars and Stripes, or did you have other sources of information?
Stars and Stripes, Armed Forces Radio Network, Armed Forces Television. I'm trying to think of it, Good Morning Vietnam, that movie. Yeah. That's the way it was. I mean, we would get our news from Armed Forces Radio Network, Armed Forces Television Network. It wasn't as sophisticated as it is today, but we got the news, and Stars and Stripes came out. I think Stars and Stripes in Vietnam was coming out daily. I also got audio tapes from my wife on the reels, and we would exchange those back and forth. So we knew what was going on. Yeah. But we also knew that we had to fight a war, and we had to survive that war. So,
Were you also there during the Tet Offensive?
No, I left Vietnam 2 days before Thanksgiving in November of 1968. And so I missed the Tet Offensive. So no, I was not there. The unit was there. The guy that replaced me got a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart because the director was attacked. Tan Son Nhut was attacked, and some of the soldiers were wounded. But I was not there. I never I never carried a weapon. I never saw combat. At times, though, it was a little scary because you could, the guard, the South Vietnamese security guards in our compound, believe it or not, wore white uniforms. And, if you looked out your window at night and you didn't see a white uniform, you said, oh, what's going on? Because they might disappear because they didn't want to but, we survived.
I'm not sure about this, but had you mentioned that you could see fighting from afar at night?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could see the mortars going off in the distance. You could see the rockets being shot. It was not near us, so it didn't really interfere with what we were doing. But you could see it at night. Yeah.
Yeah. When you were in charge of the postal directory, were you involved in making decisions about incoming mail? Like, for example, my colleague mentioned that years later, the Gulf War, the armed forces request not to bring in packages that might be offensive, like girls in bikinis or pork products. Like, was there some kind of awareness of cultural sensitivities in terms of the mail?
No,
packages? No,
not at all.
Not yet.
We would get, now it's a different time period. Okay. So the quote offensive material would be Playboy magazine, which today we kind of go, that's no big deal. So you would get magazines like that. You would get packages. Most people would send over food packages, and you'd get regular mail. There was no trying to control what came into the country. But again, we're talking a different time period. So no, we would get the mail. The mail would come in either Conex containers, which are those big things you see on trucks going down the road today, or they would just come in through the airplanes. They'd drop off. There was a round the world TWA flight that landed in Saigon 2 or 3 times a week on its way around the world. And mail would come in on that, and we would just sort it and deliver it. Mostly letters, so and magazines. And the unfortunate thing is if you got we would tell people don't send a box of cookies, because by the time we got the box of cookies was full of maggots, and you had to take those things and throw them in a burn can and burn them. You couldn't use them.
No.
But no, I can't sit here and say we were doing any kind of censorship or trying to control the mail that the troops received.
What about going out?
Going out, no problem. Most of it was letters.
Yeah.
The soldiers. You got to understand, Vietnam is a even though the North is communist, the southern part of this country is Buddhist and Catholic. There was no. I can't think of anything that would be offensive going out in the U.S. mail. Now there was prostitution, but that's true of any combat zone.
Yeah. What were your impressions of the local people? Aside from your understanding of the situation in general.
Local people were good people. We had because I was an officer, I had a housekeeper. We called her Mama San. She came in and basically came in and made the beds, swept the floors. The local people wanted to get on with their lives. They were waiters, waitresses in the officers' clubs, in the enlisted clubs. They were cab drivers, and I'm sure there were people that were wealthy. The government, which was Nguyen Cao Ky and that crowd, they were wealthy. Saigon, back in the 60s was like an old French city. It reminded people would say, well, what's Saigon like? And so, well, it's like old New Orleans. Beautiful villas. The embassies were buildings. Like if you were from Switzerland, you had a Swiss chalet. If you were a French embassy, you had a French villa, or an English country house. The presidential palace was there. The Catholic Cathedral, which has got the ironic name of Our Lady Queen of Peace. You know, it was a sleepy French city. Had a zoo, had a golf course. Believe it or not, while the war was going on, they'd have horse races in the racetrack. So you know, it was a strange war. Let me just put it to you that way.
Did you have any downtime at all when you were in Saigon? And if so, how would you spend it?
I had every Sunday off. And every Sunday I would get on the bus and I would go to there was 3 PXs in Saigon. And I'd hit all 3 PXs to see what had come in. I would sometimes go to the zoo for the afternoon. It was a lovely little zoo. So I had Sundays off. We gave each soldier a day off. And so there was always I mean, when I came back to Chicago, I was working with a guy who spent most of his time in combat. He said, don't tell me about what you did. Because, I was running a post office and then I take Sundays off, go to it was called BOQ1. It was for colonels. And only colonels could live there, but they would allow the junior officers to come in and eat lunch during the week and eat dinner. And they had a swimming pool. The funny thing about the swimming pool never worked. It had water in it, but you couldn't swim in it because the water was contaminated. Typical Vietnam. But they had music on Sunday afternoon, so you could go and have lunch and listen to the music. And that's where you could get Australian steaks and salads. And the only thing I couldn't eat was the ice cream because it was a recombined ice cream. It was horrible. So yeah, I had as I say, for Vietnam, I had a pretty good life.
So after your 7 months in Vietnam, that's the end, I believe, of your service, and you returned to the United States. So what was it like going back, and were people welcoming or hostile or neutral?
Well, first of all, when I came back, I came through the Oakland Army Terminal, and it was the Monday or Tuesday before Thanksgiving. So I had a choice. I could either leave or stay until the Monday after Thanksgiving to get my physical, my out processing physical, and I elected to leave, which in hindsight was a mistake because the VA has no record of my combat stuff, other than I was in Vietnam, so I'm entitled to some privileges. But I wanted to get home. The Spec 4 that was at Oakland said, okay, you can leave, Lieutenant, but do yourself a favor, take off your uniform and just wear civilian clothes. And there were demonstrators outside the Oakland Army Terminal, and they were demonstrating. I don't remember a lot of the detail. I suppose they were yelling and screaming, killer and stuff like that, but I don't remember that. I got home and got home in time for Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving with the family. My wife and I were still living with her parents, so I stayed there. And in October, November, and December of when I got home, or November and December, I was interviewing for civilian jobs. And ended up joining the Northern Trust Company in January of 1968. But I had no one. People were glad to see me. No one said, how was it to be a baby killer or any of that kind of stuff. I just came back. I would say that back then we didn't talk about PTSD, and I would wake up at night screaming and yelling, and that probably lasted for 4 or 5 years. In fact, to this day, well, I haven't had a night scream in a long time, but you for that. So from a personal point of view, I had what you and I today would call PTSD. We didn't call it that back then. It was come home, thanks for your service. The civilian community was angry at Vietnam, so you didn't go around saying, hey, I'm a Vietnam veteran, because that was not the thing to do. Joined the Northern Trust Company as a supervisor, supervising 60 people back doing what I was doing in Vietnam. and working with a guy who was also a Vietnam veteran. He was an enlisted, no, he wasn't, he was an officer too, but he spent most of his time in the infantry, so he had a lot of combat experience.
Yeah. Would you talk to your wife about Vietnam? Like if she, if she noticed you woke up screaming, or would you, say, gosh, I had a dream about that we were hit by whatever,
Would we talk about it? Sure. She and I would talk about it.
Yeah.
She would have to calm me down, so she knew there was some problems. We just got on with our lives. I can't really say that we sat down and talked about it indeed. She may disagree with me on that, but she knew what I did over there. She knew that it was important that I could have been killed over there. I could have been severely wounded. So we were both grateful that I came home without any physical damage. I would say, if you were to ask her today, and I would agree with her, mild-mannered John, who went to war, came home with much more intensity and anger, which I didn't have before I went to Vietnam.
Yeah.
So, and I would say that was because of the war effort. I mean, even though we'd say, well, everything's okay, you were in a combat zone. These young men and women that come back from Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan, they've seen some pretty brutal stuff. So I was lucky. I didn't see a lot of brutality. Our first sergeant lost a leg. He got mortared. But I didn't see a lot of sick people, or not sick people, wounded people.
Yeah. So you're back in Chicago, you're working at, I think, Northern Trust. So what motivates you to join the reserves?
Nothing. By the way, when you graduate from ROTC, Lieutenant, you sign a contract. And your contract says you have 2 years of active duty and 6 years in the Army Reserve.
Okay.
So you owe us 6 years. No, I don't owe you 6 years. Yes, you do. So in August of 1968, I received orders to report to the 425th Transportation Brigade, which was located in Forest Park, Illinois, which is just 5 miles north of Riverside, Illinois. And I was assigned there as an assistant adjutant general. And, I owed them 6 years. So I stayed for 2 plus 30 years. So my 6 years went into 30 years. But no, you don't. Everybody signs a contract, So when you talk to somebody who's enlisted, like my nephew, he enlisted for 3 years, and he just re-enlisted for another 3 years. So it's a contract. So,
it's a contract, and you had those 6 years as part of the contract.
And the 425th Transportation Brigade was kind of a ragtag unit. It was made up of Korean War veterans and some Vietnam veterans and some guys that were dodging going to Vietnam because they enlisted in the Army Reserve as enlisted men and got assigned to this unit, never went to war. Because remember, Lyndon Johnson wasn't activating the reserve units.
So what was the mission, or for lack of a better word, of the 425th Transportation Brigade at that time?
At that time, we commanded Army transportation units in Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Missouri, and Kansas, and Wisconsin. And we probably had 25 or 30 units. There were truck units, rail units. We had 5 battalions, and we had a personnel services company. So we were responsible for basically truck units in the Middle West, and all the rail units that were in the Army Reserve, which were 5 units.
So there's something I don't quite understand. What does it mean to be a rail unit in the Army Reserve? Like, it's not referring to the physical tracks, right? Like, what exactly is it referring to?
It does 2 things. One, it operates rail units. It operates a railroad.
Oh.
It's responsible for the track maintenance.
Oh.
And the units exist to this day. There is a railroad engine up at Fort McCoy. And so they maintain the track and they run the railroad. So you have engineers, back then you had conductors who were in the caboose. That's what they do. And the Army actually the Army has another engine at Fort Riley, Kansas, not Fort Riley, Fort Eustis. The unit trained, besides at Fort McCoy, they trained at the Twelly Naval Depot down in southern Indiana, which also has a very large railroad. So they'd come in and they'd maintain the track, they'd repair the track. If there were boxcars that needed to be maintained, they'd do that. And they would also run the railroad.
Huh. So when you were I believe the Secretary General Staff for the 425th, how many men and women worked under your command? And what in particular were you organizing?
The Secretary General Staff is actually the assistant to the Chief of Staff of the unit or to the commander. So basically my role was to keep the administrative work for the command group, the general and the 2 colonels that were in the command group, the deputy commander and the chief of staff. It was I didn't have anybody. I had a sergeant working for me, but my job was to make sure that what went into the general's office had been approved. The chief of staff had seen. I was the administrative officer for the unit. It was a good job. I mean, it was a major position. Wow. And you had responsibility for administration. So basically responsible for documents, making sure that the general saw the appropriate thing, making sure that letters that had to be signed were signed by the general. So you had interplay with the command group.
So what was the timetable? Like, did you have to go every weekend? Did you have to do also physical fitness training?
We had basically, when I first started out, it was basically every Monday night and 1 weekend a month. So the weekend drills were they were called drills, and you met 4 hours in the morning, 4 hours in the afternoon. So you got paid for 4 days. And then the Monday night drills were basically on your own time. But, let's say you couldn't make a Sunday drill for some reason, then you'd make it up on the Monday nights. So it was basically, it was 2 weekends, 2 days a month plus 4 Monday nights. So what would that be? So it'd be a total of maybe 4 days a month.
Yeah.
That's when you start out. When I got to this level, I was doing 150 days of reserve time a year.
How long were you with the 425th before you transferred to the 477th Personnel Services Company?
Okay, I was with the you know, unfortunately, the notes that I have that I sent you, I couldn't find this morning. I filed them somewhere and I can't find them.
You know, I think I see a note here myself because I was also trying to keep track. Does that sound right to you that you were with the 477th from July 1972 to September 1974?
Yes.
Okay.
And basically, the 477th Personnel Services Company is a subordinate unit of the 425th Transportation Brigade. So I was put in as a commander of that unit. So I was the company commander. It was a major's position. And as a Secretary General Staff, remember, I was a major. So I went into this position. And the role of the 477th Personnel Services Company was basically, it was if you think about where is your personnel record at the Pritzker Military Library, there's somebody there that keeps track of that record. That's what the 477th Personnel Services Company did. So we kept track of the records for every soldier in the 425th Transportation Brigade.
Wow.
And so it was a continuation of personnel work, Adjutant General Corps. We had our summer camps at Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana, or at St. Louis Record Center. And we would go in and we'd work on records. For example, when we went to St. Louis, we were converting paper records to microfiche records. And of course, today they're all probably on a stick that you stick in the computer. But that's what the personnel, and I did that for 2 years. And so as a commander, that was my first taste of company command.
So what was it like, company command?
Well, I was in charge. I mean, when I said, you're going to do this, you did it. The lieutenants knew that I was in charge. The first sergeant knew I was in charge. I had the authority to basically tell whatever it was, 150 men and women what to do. By then, we were getting women in the reserve. So we had some women in the 477th Personnel Services Company.
Was it in this capacity when Colonel Thomas Crow asked you to reorganize a unit?
Well, General, again, I wish I had my notes in front of me, and I don't.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I have a note here that at some point, I don't know if this is General or Colonel Thomas Crow, asked you to reorganize a unit that was having difficulties, and you did so within, I believe, a few months.
Okay.
Maybe that's a different point. Yeah.
No, I think what you're referring to is General Crow asked me to take command of the 419th Transportation Company. Does that make sense? What happened after the 477?
Okay, so I see here you're next at the Adjutant General at the 425th from October 74 to June 1975.
Okay. And that means I was the Chief Administrative Officer for the 425th Transportation Brigade. I was responsible for all the personnel. I was responsible for the record keeping. That's what the Adjutant General does.
Okay. And you also, somebody had written about you, or maybe this was when you received an award, you wrote, it was written about you, his administrative and executive ability were outstanding, and he had a strong command voice. So what does it mean to have a strong command voice?
Well, the Adjutant General is responsible for running formations and for ceremonies. So, my job was to say, units at attention. And so I had a very strong ability to, for people to hear me when we were doing a parade or we were in large formation. I think that's what he's referring to.
So it seems to me that we want to talk about what you had mentioned earlier when you were at the 419th Transportation Battalion at Fort Sheridan. Is that, would that be correct?
Yeah, actually the 419th Transportation Battalion, yes, it was at Fort Sheridan. And I was responsible for, besides the battalion headquarters, of which I was a lieutenant colonel at this point, I was also responsible for, I had 4 units under me. Believe it or not, a parachute packing unit and 3 truck companies. And the truck companies, one was at Fort Sheridan, one was in Peoria, Illinois, and the other 2 units were in Indiana. I think they were in East Chicago, Indiana. And the one of the units was in just terrible. It had failed its inspections for like 3 or 4 times. And the General Crow asked me, "You've got to fix this thing." And I was able to, by changing some leaders, by putting some hard work into it, we were able to fix the unit, and it started passing its inspections.
What was the nature of the problems? Was it more along the mechanical issues or personnel issues, or
all of the above? The unit had problems with its personnel records. It had problems with getting people qualified to do their job properly. They had trucks that didn't work properly, that weren't being maintained. They had leadership. They had sergeants that were there too long. And we just needed to go in and say, okay, item by item, how do we take the checklist and let's fix the problem? And that's what we did. And now, again, I was the leader, but I had a team that worked with me. It's always important to remember, you get things done the way you want them done through using other people. So I always had a team around me.
Did you have any say-so as to who would be, let's say, your second in command, whatever the term it would be?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, I could select my executive officer. He was the second in command. He was usually in a battalion. I was a lieutenant colonel, and the major was the XO, and usually there was another major in the unit who was also what's known as the G3, or the guy responsible for operations. And then the rest of the people in the unit were either captains or lieutenants. But yes, I could select my executive officer. Now, sometimes I would go into a unit and there'd be an executive officer there who is very good, so I certainly wouldn't replace him.
No.
And these were all reservists. So that's, I think one of the things that's important about what I'm talking about is, the Pritzker Military Library is dedicated to the reserves and the National Guard. And so I had these were all reserve units, and the 419th was at Fort Sheridan.
I know that according to the law, the employer has to give the employee time to do the reserves. But did that ever cause any issues with you, especially those initial 6 years of your reserves when you were, relatively new at them?
No, not really, because during the initial 6 years, it was on the weekends, or it was on a weeknight.
Right.
So there would be problems if I had to leave work on a Monday night, say. But usually the drill started I ended work at Northern Trust at 5 o'clock, and the drills would start about 6:30 or 7 o'clock. So no, there was no problem. And as a matter of fact, both at the Northern Trust and at the Exchange Bank, one of the officers there was a very senior officer in the Naval Reserve. In fact, he retired as a Navy Rear Admiral in the reserves.
Wow.
So no, I never had any problems. There was some funny moments, but no, I never had. And the Northern Trust back in those days and still is to this day, very supportive of the military. So no problem.
And maybe I ignored a point that you just made 2 minutes ago, that you're saying you're emphasizing the fact that these are the reserves. And is that, and I think you're alluding to the idea that maybe they're like the citizen soldier. Like in other words, why do you think the fact that people carrying out this work in the military being reserves is important?
It's important because if you're going to go into a combat situation, or let me go back a bit. You don't need a lot of transportation people or a lot of postal people on active duty. You need a certain number to support the folks that are on active duty. But if you go into a combat situation or a war is declared, you're going to, instead of having 100 truck companies, you may need 200 truck companies. And so the second 200 are in the reserve components. They're in the National Guard or they're in the Army Reserve. So you don't need them full time. Now, there's been a change in philosophy because of the long-term war in Afghanistan, Iran, and Iraq. So some reservists are called up more frequently, and that does create a challenge for employers. But back then, we were truly a reserve force. Once I got back from Vietnam, until Desert Storm and Desert Shield, no one was called up. I mean, but once Desert Storm and Desert Shield occurred, we were activating units, from an entomology detachment all the ways up to a combat service hospital. So that's and the reserves are important because they keep their military skills up, but they're also participating in the civilian community.
It's true. There isn't such a division.
That's right. And the National Guard is important because the National Guard has an additional mission, and that's the state mission, which the governor uses in natural disasters, in riots. It's been very quiet, but the medical units of the Illinois National Guard have been giving vaccines for the last 6 months.
That's right. That's right.
We don't say, oh wow, we've activated it. Well, those are soldiers that are not working in their civilian jobs.
True.
And they're serving the state of Illinois. So.
True. Okay, so here I must admit I'm a little bit not clear. After you're with the 419th, do you go, is your next assignment part of the 336 transportation group in Milwaukee, or are you back in the 425th as the Inspector General?
I'm back as the Inspector General in the 425th Transportation Brigade. And the job of the Inspector General is to do a couple of things. One, to do IG or inspector, do inspections of subordinate units. Remember we talked about the company that I turned around?
Yes.
My job as the Brigade Inspector General is to go inspect companies and battalions that are part of the brigade. So I have a team of people that go in and say, is your admin okay? Is your personnel records okay? Is your trucks working properly? Is your supply, all of this, that's called the inspections. The other thing that the Inspector General does is there's a rumor that Tom Jones, Captain Tom Jones and the 14th Dump Truck Company is not using funds properly. Would you go inspect and see if that's really true? Another one might be, we've received a complaint from Congressman Jones that the company commander is harassing the women in the unit. Would you go do an inspection? So I do that. And then the last thing is that I'm responsible for making sure that the brigade headquarters passes its inspection. So
at that highest level.
So the Fifth Army comes down and inspects us. So that's the role of the Inspector General. And you are trained. They send you to Washington for a 2-week course on how to become an inspector general. So it's a big deal. Not everybody can be an inspector general. You have to be known as somebody of high integrity. You have to be known as somebody who'll get the job done. And it's an important position. It's an important non-command position. And so I was fortunate enough to become the inspector general. And I think I did that for 2 or 3 years. So.
And it seems to me it encompasses such a broad range of things, from accounting to, potential sexual harassment to mechanical workings,
Yeah.
etc. Yeah. I think it was at this point where you were praised for having listened to the complaints of the brigade personnel, as well as following up with recommendations. So it made me wonder, in the past, before you took on this role, had the inspector general typically not listened to, let's say, the rank and file?
Okay. No, the inspector generals of the brigade, what that comment is somebody's praising me for doing the job that I'm supposed to be doing. The previous inspector general actually, if my memory serves correctly, eventually went on to be a brigadier general. So no, the inspector, I was fulfilling the role, and the men that had the role before me, they fulfilled that role as well. And what it led to is, while I was the inspector general, I was accepted, I believe, because when I graduated from the Army War College, I was a lieutenant colonel. So I attended the Army War College through distance learning, and 2 summers I was physically at Carlisle Barracks.
And what type of research or learning were you doing at the U.S. Army War College?
Okay, the Army War College prepares men and women to serve the Army at the director level, which means they are colonels or above. So we study strategy at the Army War College. My area of expertise, I chose Africa and the Middle East. And so what you're taught at the Army War College is to think as a strategist, because everything you've done before that, you've been a tactical person. And it's to be selected for the Army War College as a reservist is a big deal. The class that I was in, besides myself, there was a doctor who was already a brigadier. There was the chief of the Army Nurse Corps, who was a brigadier. There was a man who eventually became the chief of the Army Reserve. We had 15 men and women who eventually became general officers in my class. So the War College develops you to be a strategic thinker. So when you see the generals today on television, whether it's the chief of staff of the Army or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, all those people are graduates of the war colleges. You're either a graduate of the Air Force, Army, or Navy War College. So it was, for me as a lieutenant colonel, being selected to attend that was really very special.
Very special.
And I give a lot of credit to the generals that I was working for, General Crow and General Berner. They were men that saw that I had potential, and I was able, fortunately, to attend the War College. The good news is my wife was able to come with me during the annual training. A lot of the work was done at home. Back then, you didn't have Xerox machines. Well, you had Xerox machines, but you couldn't do what I just did, is pull this thing up off my computer. Everything was done by typing, and it had to be perfect. And I got through the Army War College with the help of my wife, who was my typist, and she was a good typist. And it was on an IBM Selectric, so you would study, present papers, and then you'd go to. We went twice. Then the second summer we graduated. So It was a big deal.
So can you give an example to the layperson as to the shift in thinking between tactical and strategic in your areas of expertise, like transportation, personnel, and records?
Tactical would be, I want to move the 101st Airborne Division from point A to point B, and what all that involves: the trucks, the airplanes, the strategic would be, how are we going to plan this effort? How are we going to, where do we want the 101st Airborne to be in 3 months? Are they going to be in Europe? And how are we going to get them there? So it's the long-range planning versus short-range planning. So,
which would require more, more understanding of where the country is heading, I would think.
Sure. For example, right now, the President of the United States has said we're going to leave Afghanistan by September. Mm-hmm. That's the general order. Now, somebody's got to do all the strategic planning to do this, and then practically, how are we moving equipment out of Afghanistan, or are we leaving equipment? So one's long range, one's short range.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wow. And although it was at a distance, when you were there, when you were at Carlisle Barracks for the summer, did you have, I don't know what to call it, like intellectual exchanges with other military people who had also been selected for this program?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We were broken down into study groups of about 6 or 7 people each study group. So there was about 150 people. Mm-hmm. We also had the opportunity to have lectures by the Chief of Staff of the Army, by other general officers, by civilians, Secretary of this or Secretary of that, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Army. We were fortunate. In my class, Lieutenant General James Gavin. General Gavin was a legend from World War II and Korea. He came and lectured us and then stayed and answered questions. That sticks in my mind. So you had retired military leaders. So, today you might have General Vono come, or you might have General Odierno come. You might have a colonel. I can't quickly grab the book, but there was a colonel who wrote a book called On Strategy, and he was an expert in Clausewitz and strategic thinking. He would come and talk to us and lecture us, and then question and answers. So the answer is yes. We would be exposed to senior leaders of both, and some of them were from the other services too. We had guys in our class and women who were from the other services, from the Navy and the Air Force. There were not a lot, but they would send Army people to go to the Naval War College or the Air Force War. So it was a chance to. So tell me what the strategy is of the United States Army today, and we could talk about that. And in fact, the national strategy. From the national strategy, you get the defense strategy, and from the defense strategy, you get all the. Who writes those booklets? The colonels at the director level. And that's what we're studying at the War College.
Wow, that's impressive. So after the War College, is that when you become the battalion commander of the 425th?
No. After the War College, I become the commander of the 336 Transportation Group.
Oh.
And the 336 Transportation Group is at Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so I commute to Milwaukee, Wisconsin for, I guess, about 3 years, maybe 2 years. And as the commander of the 336 Transportation Group, I had 2 battalions under me. I had a truck battalion with 3 companies, and I had the Army Rail Battalion with 4 companies under me. And those companies were a company down in Granite City, Indiana, the 226. And then I had the 1150th, 51st, and 52nd, which were located in Milwaukee and Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. They were rail units. The other units were truck units. I was a colonel then. So I was, so when I graduated from the Moore College, I returned back and I was a colonel and I commanded the 336 Transportation Group.
Were you with the 336 when you purchased the 2 electromotor diesel engines?
You know, I've got to go back and look at that. I think I was in the 420. I had left the 336 and I was in the 425th Transportation Brigade. I was looking at that the other day and I should have pulled it out. But that was kind of an interesting story because the rail units did not have an operating engine.
So it didn't work, no?
So they had to borrow an engine from the Wisconsin Central Railroad. I don't even know if that railroad exists today. And they were able to get the one from the Wisconsin Central Railroad because one of the guys in the unit, a captain in the unit, was an officer at the Wisconsin Central Railroad. So they would borrow this engine. And when I was at the 425th, we started talking about we need to get an engine of our own. And at the time, these engines were made by the Electromotive Company out here in McCook, Illinois. And I'm not quite sure how it worked, but they were getting out of the business. And I was able to purchase 2 engines for $150,000 each. And so I went to the 5th Army commander, Lieutenant General James Hall, and said to General Hall, I need $300,000. And General Hall said, and we're talking what, I guess in the 1980s? Yeah, probably. And General Hall says, well, I'm not giving you $300,000. Go talk to Bill Ward. And Major General Ward was the chief of the Army Reserve. And he was a West Point guy and just a really good guy. So I literally called General Hall and said, or not General Hall, General Ward. And I said, Bill, General Hall won't give me $300,000 that I need to buy 2 engines that will be delivered to Fort McCoy at no cost to us. And Ward said to me, you got it. So he picks up the phone, calls Hall and says, I'm transferring $300,000 to you and you're to give it to Scully to buy these 2 engines. So I get 1 engine because the Army, the active Army, decides they could use one of the engines down at Fort Eustis. Now, to this day, those 2 engines are still at Fort McCoy and Fort Eustis. And my guys in the 336 Trans group said they wanted to name the engine at Fort McCoy at the time it was the Brigadier General Scully engine. So I get a call from the Judge Advocate General at 5th Army, and he says, can't do that. You have to be dead to have something named after you. And since you're not dead, well, I still have it on my bookcase. I have a little miniature of this engine that's up at Fort McCoy. And so these engines are still there. And the nice thing about it is I have a ribbon, the Legion of Merit, which is this purple ribbon right here.
Yeah.
The next commander of 5th Army, that's the one I'm most proud of. I got that ribbon for getting the 2 engines for the Army.
Well, I think very well deserved. Imagine what would happen if the other guy lost his job, no more engines at all, you know.
So if you ask me, which one's more important, the Distinguished Service Medal for 9 years as a general or the Legion of Merit for getting 2 engines for Fort McCoy and Fort Eustis, and they're still used to this day. And to me, that's what the reserve components are all about. Tell us what you need, and we'll figure out a way to get it done.
Wow.
So that was done while I was at the 425. At the 425, I served as the deputy commander, the chief of staff, and ultimately the commanding general of the 425th Transportation Brigade.
Did your impressions of the 425 change as you rose in rank? And had the 425 changed over time?
Yeah, it's gone away. It no longer exists.
Oh, I meant the years that you were
deactivated it. The answer is the Army Reserve changed. The Army Reserve, when I joined the Army Reserve in 1968 at 425 at Fort Sheridan, not at Fort Sheridan, at Forest Park, Illinois, was a unit, and all of the reserves was this way. Because the war was going on, we had wooden rifles. We didn't have rifles that you could shoot. We'd get them when we went up to shoot at Fort McCoy. We had leaders who were Korean War veterans who did not believe in the Army education system because they were just there. When I came in, I was told, don't waste your time going to school. Well, I looked around and I figured out that if you go to school, the Army schooling, by the time you get ready for promotion, if you got the schooling, you're going to get promoted. And I was getting promoted past the Korean War guys. The Army Reserves and the National Guard were pretty weak. The 477th, which I commanded, had lawyers, White Sox players, guys who were avoiding the draft. So it was a pretty much of a ragtag outfit. When we got to the time I was commanding the brigade, and afterwards, the Army Reserve and the National Guard, especially here in Illinois, I wouldn't have given you a nickel for the National Guard back in the 60s or the reserves. But today, and by the time we got to Desert Storm and Desert Shield, we were a force that the Army could not do without. You needed the reserve components to come on active duty to flesh out the active Army. You needed the National Guard. The National Guard, for example, today is aligned with the Polish Army in Illinois. We are a strong force. So the answer is, major changes, because we started putting money into the Army Reserve and the National Guard, and we started saying to them, you just can't show up for 2 weekends a month, and after the drill go to the bar, and that had to go away. And so you had to get your schooling, you had to be educated, you had to know what your mission was, and you had to be ready to be activated. So by the time I was commander of the 425, and by the way, the guy that was commander before then and the guy that was commander afterwards, we could say the same thing about them. They knew what the mission was, and they worked hard to make sure that if the reserves got called up, we were ready to go. And our truck
unit, a higher level of preparedness.
Correct. But see, this was all post-Vietnam, and you had to build back up. You had to gain respect and dignity. And today, I would no problem. When you go to combat with the Guard or reserves, you can't tell whether they're active Army or reservists. And that's what you wanted. And that's what we eventually ended up in, from the 425 all the ways up through the 102nd ARCOM. We had units that were well prepared and well trained.
Wow. So going back to Desert Storm and Desert Shield, was this at the point when you were commanding the 102nd Army Reserve Command? But I guess more to the point, how did it work? Here you are, there's a war. You're commanding reserve
Sure. And
How-
in actual fact, when Desert Storm and Desert Shield started, I was with the 86th Army Reserve Command as the deputy commander. So I had left the 425.
Oh, okay,
I had
yes.
been selected by a board to go to the 86th Army Reserve Command as the deputy commander. And we activated here in Illinois, we activated probably 10,000 soldiers. And they ranged, and I literally mean this, we had a 7-man entomology detachment that was made up of colonels and lieutenant colonels, PhDs from the University of Chicago, University of Illinois, and they were one of the first units to deploy to overseas to look at the bugs and the animals in the desert, to hospital units, to a couple of engineer units. So I was with the 86th Army Reserve Command, and I was with them for about 18 months. I was then selected to go to be the command. It was kind of funny. You had to go before a competitive board, and the commander of the 86th at the time was a guy by the name of Major General Roger Sandler, who went on to be the chief of the Army Reserve. And Roger called me in. And he said, "I got good news and bad news. The good news is you've been selected to be a major general. The bad news is you're going to St. Louis, Missouri, instead of the 86th ARCOM." And so I went down to the 102nd ARCOM, and I was sent down there for 2 reasons. One, we continue activating troops. We ended up sending 15,000 soldiers to the combat zone. As a general, the generals that back in those days were not being activated. So I stayed at the 102nd. I was there for 5 years. Had some challenges. I had to replace my chief of staff. I had some guys that thought they had divine right to the positions they were in. I had to move them out. But I also had some great people down there. I had a guy by the name of Clyde Jones, who was my senior civilian. Had a chief of staff. My second chief of staff was outstanding. And I commanded down there for 5 years, from 1990 through 1995.
Had your whole family moved there as well?
No, I commuted down. Now we're back to, so how much time did you spend on active duty? I spent every weekend in St. Louis, Missouri. And I spent, by then I was on the Armed Reserve Forces Policy Committee. I would spend probably 2 weeks a year in Washington, D.C. So I was doing about 100 days of active duty when I was the 2-star commander, the major general commanding the 102nd ARCOM. This is where you really need the support of the company you're working for. And at the time, I was the head of human resources for the Exchange National Bank. Good news is the chief operating officer for the bank was a rear admiral in the Naval Reserve. And my boss, and we were, by the time when I was commanding, we also sold the Exchange Bank to LaSalle Bank. Oh. Chairman of the board of LaSalle Bank was a former Army intelligence officer. So they were always supportive.
Yeah.
Sometimes it got a little dicey when they said, "Where's Scully?" or "Where's the Admiral?" But for the most part, they were very supportive. I would say the negative factor is maybe when it came to bonus time, maybe you wouldn't get a big a bonus. I know that my bonuses increased once I retired from the reserves, but the banks were always supportive of the reserve components. In fact, one day the chairman called me in and said, "Why isn't Joe Blow here?" I said, "Well," and Joe Blow is the admiral. He said, "Why wasn't Admiral Blow here?" I said, "Well, the admiral is working with the Secretary of the Navy right now, Mr. Chairman, and he outranks you." And he just rolled. but I was always supported. And so it's key that as you rise in rank in the reserves, that people understand that. Today, civilian employers have to understand when a reservist gets called up, and it can get really dicey. Because, the police department up in Woodruff, Wisconsin, where I have a summer home, there's only 5 men in the police department. And when one of them goes, that hurts.
Yeah.
And so you've always got to remember that the civilian community has to support the reserve components. So anyways, I had a great military experience. And as you can see from that young kid that took the hill at Fort Riley, Kansas, I was able to continue to get leadership position. I was fortunate I commanded 13 of my 32 years.
Wow. I believe at the next stage, you were working on policy with the Army Reserve Forces Policy Committee at the Pentagon. Would you like to talk about that?
Sure. The funny thing is the Army Reserve, we call it the ARFPIC, the Army Reserve Forces Policy Committee. It's part of the Secretary of the Army's office. And our liaison was a young Major General by the name of Eric Shinseki. And General Shinseki went on to become the Chief of Staff of the Army and eventually the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. What we did was it was made up of 5 National Guard generals, 5 reserve generals, and then 5 generals from the active Army. And our job was to look at the policies, and I'll give you an example. The warrant officer training program. To become a warrant officer, you usually are a sergeant, usually an E6. You have a skill that the Army wants, but doesn't want you to be an officer. And that skill, but they want you to be a warrant officer because they want you to develop that skill. So they would send people from the reserves and the National Guard to the warrant officer training course down at Fort Rucker, Alabama. Don't ask me why it's there, but that's where it's at. And the Guard guys would show up and they would fail the first PT test. So why would they fail the first PT test? Well, because the Guard guys would say, well, the active Army is unfair. They're making these guys do a PT test and blah, 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 blah. Well, how can we solve this problem? Because we're losing people. Well, our job was to look at the alternatives. And what we ended up doing is they'd get a pre-test before they came. And then after 2 weeks, instead of the first day, get acclimated. And guess what? They all started passing their test. That's a simple example, but that's the kind of thing that the Army Reserve Forces Policy Committee looked at. So what is now the policy is instead of day 1 training or a PT test, we take the test at the 14th day or the 15th day. That's what the ARFPIC does. We'd also get briefed on some of the things that the active Army was looking at, and we'd be asked the question, could the reserve units do this? Could the Guard units do this? And we'd work together to solve strategic problems. Again, coming on experience from the Army War College. But that's what the ARFPIC, and we did that. The nice thing is the ARFPIC, I got it out. The ARFPIC, let's see if I can show it to you. Being on the Army Reserve Policy Committee, we got the Army Staff Badge, which you have to be on it for 3 years. And that was another, it's going to sound silly, but all these ribbons and medals are important in the reserve, in the military, because they kind of show what you've done. Well, this badge, which is known as the liver patch, you couldn't get it if you were on the Army Reserve Forces Policy Committee because you were a reservist and you weren't spending 1 year in the Pentagon. Well, it took us 2 years to work with Eric Shinseki and other members of the Army staff. And it was decided that if you're on the Army Reserve Forces Policy Committee for 3 years, you get the patch.
Yeah. It's like almost assessing and rethinking policies and how to change them. And
And you see that today. I mean, they might come in, and I'm sure they did this recently in the last 2 years. They come in with a new uniform that they're wearing in the Army, which I don't have. But, you know, they come in, they say, should we go back to the old World War II uniform where we have the tan pants, or should we go to berets, or you know, more importantly, do we have enough divisions in the Army? Should we have a reserve division or a guard division? So it's that kind of discussion, and it's not nitty gritty, but you know, it's important items. So
yes.
Yeah.
Just would you like to talk like about the different ribbons and decorations that you're wearing now that we're thinking about it?
Well, you know, the top ribbons are the personal ribbons. This is the Distinguished Service Medal. That's given for mostly to general officers. Now, there's also a Distinguished Service ribbon, Distinguished Service Cross, which is given for combat. This is the same ribbon, but mine is for being a general. So when you see that ribbon, the first question that always comes to mind is that a Distinguished Service Cross? And if it is, that's one step below the Medal of Honor. So it's a pretty important ribbon.
Yeah.
This one here is one we talked about. That's the Legion of Merit. That was kind of fun. This one here is, let me see here. This one here, I'm not sure what this one is. I'll have to think about that. Then you've got the Army Commendation Ribbon, and the rest of these are what I call show-up ribbons. Which means, for example, this one here says I was in the reserves. This one here says I was in Vietnam for 2 tours. So, and
on the other side,
this one here, this is the 425th Transportation patch, that unit citation that they received in World War II. This one says I'm in the Transportation Corps. So.
Cool.
I gotta figure out what this one. Oh, this one is the Meritorious Service Medal. So
that was for procuring the 2 engines, right?
Yeah. No, this is the Legion of Merit. This is the Meritorious Service Medal. This is for just doing some things in the Army.
Oh, okay.
3 ribbons that are what I call personal ribbons. So.
Okay, cool. So
I'm trying.
So after, I forget the acronym, but after you're with the planning for the ARFCOP, whatever it is, then you, I believe you're the commanding general of the 102nd Army Reserve Command.
Mm-hmm.
And what duties did you have at that point?
Well, it's pretty much the same duties as you have at any other unit level. I commanded. We had units in Missouri, Southern Illinois, and Kansas. I'm going to say we probably had 80 units, ranging from a helicopter, Black Hawk helicopter detachment, to hospitals, to artillery units, to personnel units, to transportation units. By then, the Transportation Corps, the brigade, did not have the transportation units in Missouri or Kansas. I had a budget of close to $25 million. I had court-martial authority, so as a general, I could also award meritorious service medals, Army Commendation medals. I basically had responsibility for the Army Reserve in 3 states Illinois, Kansas, and Missouri. I had several colonels reporting to me. So basically I was running a small, not a small business, a medium-sized business. At the time, I was one of 6 ARCOM, Army Reserve commands in the United States Army Reserve. It's since reorganized. The 102nd ARCOM is now down in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. It's called the 102nd Army Reserve Division. It's a 1-star command. The 86th Army Reserve has been merged into the 88th Army Reserve Command, which is located in Fort McCoy. So the reserves have consolidated. But my responsibility was basically, I had full responsibility. I mean, I had court-martial authority. I could court-martial people. I could.
Did you have to use? Did you have to exercise court-martial?
I never did. I did some reviews of some cases that I don't care to talk about.
Sure.
But I had review authority. I had a judge advocate general. I had a colonel. I had a controller. All these people were full colonels. Some of them went on to be general officers in the Army. It was a very good command. I enjoyed it. It was 5 years. It went by very quickly. It was a great experience, and it was a great culmination to a very special Army career.
Yeah. So what made you decide to retire from it in 1996?
I wasn't selected for another position. I was being considered for a couple of other assignments, and the Army selected somebody else. And so I did not have, when you're at the rank of a major general, unless you get another assignment. I just think about it. I had 2 assignments as a brigadier general and 1 assignment as a major general. That major general assignment is normally a 3-year assignment, but I had 5 years in that role. I was being considered for 2 other assignments, and I was not selected. One of which, Mrs. Scully voiced her opinion, one of which was a unit that was going to be tied to the 8th Army in Korea. And she didn't think it was a very good idea for me to be commuting back and forth from Iowa to Korea. And so I didn't get that job, basically because she said you can't apply for it. And the other job I was not selected. They selected instead of selecting an Army guy, they selected a Navy guy. And so it was time to retire. And frankly, I was 54 years old. That allowed me to devote time and energy to my job as head of human resources for LaSalle Bank here in Chicago, which I stayed at from 96 to 2006 when I retired from the Exchange Bank, the LaSalle Bank. And I have no regrets. I basically then became the ambassador for the U.S. Army Reserve for Illinois. And a few years later, I became the senior, my mind just blanked. I became the civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army representing the state of Illinois. And I did that for 11 years. I just retired from that position. Believe it or not, I was in Washington, D.C. in February of last year. That was our last airplane trip. I was retired as a civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army, Illinois, and had a chance to meet the Secretary and get a nice certificate. So that was very special. My wife was there. And so now I am officially retired from all Army stuff. And pretty much retired from, I do some consulting work for Challenger Gray and Christmas, but I'm pretty much retired now.
Yeah. Oh, well, sounds like you're saying a very fascinating and important career. And both the military and civilian and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's kind of just some questions more of opinion, I'd say,
Okay.
than chronology. So do you think that Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm like proved the worth of the reserves?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, you could not have fought those wars without the Army Reserve or National Guard. And that to me was really the culmination of post-Vietnam all the ways up to that point. That's where we really saw, and the active Army saw, and frankly, the Navy and the Air Force saw the value of the reserve components. So absolutely. I have no problem answering that question with a strong affirmative.
Sure. So one thing that I wonder about is how did you manage to juggle your reserve with your day job, with your at times your studies, with your family life? It seems quite daunting.
Well, the interesting thing is when I was a major and a lieutenant colonel,
Mm-hmm.
my wife and I made a decision that if we were going to go to Fort McCoy or Fort Bliss for summer camp, we'd take the kids with us. Yeah. A swimming pool is a swimming pool. Whether you're at a motel outside of Fort McCoy or you're on a swimming pool on the post of Fort McCoy. So the kids grew up with it, and they were supportive of it. I will say that my son John, I said, "Are you going to be an ROTC at Notre Dame?" He's, "Dad, I've been in the Army for long enough. I'm not going to join." Funny thing was, his roommate, I commissioned his roommate. His roommate is a full colonel now in the Army Reserve, in the Army, active Army. But the kids grew up with it. Judy, we just made do. We just did what we had to do. While I was in the Army Reserve, my wife was earning her doctorate in education. So she has 2 master's degrees and a doctorate. And she was a school psychologist for Richmond Public School during the time that I was doing the Army Reserve. So you just do it.
Yeah.
You know, and it just became a part of our lives. We knew on Saturdays or Sundays I'd be in the reserves. Sometimes she'd come with, sometimes the kids would come with, but it was just the way it was. Now, the negative, I probably missed more sporting events than I should have, and some family events, but for the most part, we just made do with it. It was just the way it was. And I'm trying to think, my kids weren't overly active in sports, so it wasn't critical. I never missed a holiday.
Yeah.
So, you know.
How many kids do you have?
I have 3 adult children. 2 daughters live here in Riverside, Illinois. One daughter's husband works for the LaGrange Police Department. The other daughter's husband is a physicist. He's got his doctorate. And my daughter, my daughter is a marketing director for an accounting firm. And my son John and his wife live up in Wilmette, Illinois. And John works for Bank of America. He's a senior officer with them. And I have 4 grandchildren. One's 21. She graduated from Clemson in December, and she has a job. The other one is her sister just graduated from Riverside Brookfield High School. She's going to the University of Dayton. And I got 2 younger grandchildren who are in 7th and 8th grade up in Wilmette. And not sure where they're going to high school or college yet. So everybody has their COVID shots, so we're all good.
It's all good. I see some of the questions you already answered, but one thing was, how did the developments in technology change, either in terms of transportation or in terms of record keeping, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. I think when I joined the Army Reserve, literally we were using mimeograph machines. And I'm sure today, if I said that to one of my grandchildren, they'd have no idea what a mimeograph machine was. That moved on to the Xerox or copy machine. Today, if you ask me, can I have a copy of a document? I say, sure, I'll scan it and I'll email it to you. So that makes a big difference. Record keeping is no longer on a piece of paper or a microfiche. It's now on a stick. So that's the big difference. Today, if you don't have a computer in combat, you can't move the vehicle. You can't shoot the weapon. We're seeing it today with these terrorists that are attacking our computer systems. So that's the biggest difference. Weaponry is more sophisticated. We can sit here like you and I are talking. Well, somebody in the Pentagon can sit in the Pentagon or out at Rock Island Arsenal and watch a truck going down the road in Afghanistan. That's the difference. You can have a young man or a young woman sitting in an Air Force base in Missouri firing a drone rocket at a tank in Iraq. That's the difference.
You
can, and that's the major difference. The highly sophisticated. I mean, someday what we're talking about today is really cool, but it'll be so much more sophisticated in the future.
True.
Space program has had a lot to do with it. You and I benefit from that. Putting a rover on Mars. What an amazing thing. That's the difference, So.
I'm not sure if this is a little too far-fetched, but I was sort of reading about the U.S. Transportation Command that has a mission to integrate mobility operations leading to joint deployment, distributive enterprise, etc. So it made me wonder, do you think that working jointly is the most effective way to organize transportation? Do you need the Air Force in conjunction with the Army, et cetera, et cetera?
The answer is yes. The U.S. Army Transportation Command, which is located at Scott Air Force Base, controls the movement of all military assets throughout the world. And it's important that they have the ability to know where the airplanes are, where the ships are, and where the trucks are. And jointness is the way to go because there are certain skills in each branch of the military that the other branch doesn't have. So it's critical, it's critical. For example, the Army needs to know I've got to have transportation at the Oakland terminal because a ship is coming in with containers that needs to be moved to the middle of the United States. We need to get out of Afghanistan. How many Air Force C-130s do we need to move the trucks, the tanks, the Jeeps? So that's why you need a jointness. Today, people don't wear these stars unless they've had joint experience. And you usually get joint experience at the lieutenant colonel and above level. So it's very important. So I think it's critical.
I found some very interesting questions off a website and wonder if you'd like to answer them. The one question is, how does understanding a country's ability to generate, transport, sustain, and redeploy military forces contribute to its understanding of its national power?
We have to have the ability to be flexible, and we have to have the ability to move equipment supplies, and personnel quickly throughout the world. The fact that we have the ability to do that makes it, our enemy understands and knows that if they attack us, we can respond fairly quickly. Now, having said that, one of the issues that is facing the military today, and this has got nothing to do with the Army, is do we have enough ships to be present in the South China Sea? Do we have enough ships to be present over in the Middle East to project our power so the Chinese know if they decide they want to invade Taiwan, that we will respond in no uncertain terms. So I think it's important, and frankly, we look at our enemy today. China has the ability to project. Russia, when you really stop and think about it, only has the ability to project in the European or the Northern European area or the Eastern European area. And Iraq, I'm not quite sure what they got, because I mean they just lost a ship, probably by their own fault. So, you know, those are our three. And North Korea, what can North Korea really project? How close can North Korea come to attack us? And I can tell you, it's called Kauai and Maui and Honolulu. So they can get a rocket. So we got to be able to respond to that. Which we can, by the way, which we can. I'm just using these
trying to get
as notional, just the big picture. But that's the kind of thing that the folks in the Pentagon are looking at strategy. And do we have enough to respond? Now, the challenge for us is, do we want to spend more money on military or domestic? And that's the debate that's going on right now.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, okay, this may be a bit of a loaded question from this website, but I'll read it anyhow. If the military continues to optimize its distribution capabilities toward a just-in-time concept, will maneuver leaders be confident enough with their resources to audaciously close with and destroy the enemy?
I guess that question is an open question.
Yeah.
I truly think that today we can respond, but you know, what does quickness mean? Quickness means 60 to 90 days. You know, I don't see us right now having to respond. That's a tough one. It's actually a tough question to answer.
Yeah.
I think we do. But we have to be cautious, and I would have to say you're asking me a question that's above my pay grade. But this is the kind of question that they debate in the Department of Defense and in the Secretary of State's office.
Okay.
I can't really give you a good answer.
That's fine. That's fine. Well, one last question. It may be like you're saying, it may not be appropriate, but how can maneuver leaders balance the need to cater quality of life expectations of an all-volunteer force and the desire to minimize the logistics footprint in an active theater of operations?
Well, I think in some ways you've asked two questions there. The quality of life that we have to provide to today's military is very important. I think the Army does a fairly good job of it because a soldier can be assigned to a military base. Right now, I would say, unless you're in the infantry or special forces, I have a nephew right now that spent his entire career at Fort Bragg. He's in his 4th year. In fact, I told him the other day, you either go to OCS or deploy, because you got to do something different. And he's in the Transportation Corps. We provide good housing. The real issue is what to do with the spouse. And I'm talking about a female spouse. We need to make sure that she has good quality of life, good schools, good housing, and more importantly, the access to a good job. Yeah. And that's a challenge that we face. The Navy has the challenge of long tour deployments. But the point is, we have to, if we're going to have a volunteer force, which we have to think about the whole family. And sometimes we don't. And the Army is bending over backwards to do that. But it's really up to each individual base and each individual commander. So, and you kind of see an example of that. The guys at Fort Bragg and Fort Benning, they seem to have the family involved. The guys out at Fort Hood, they lost the big picture. You also have to be cognizant of the fact that the military today is made up of men and women. The units that I commanded, you could probably count the number of women in the unit on one hand. And I mean, I had a master sergeant. She was a wonderful lady. But I didn't have any other master sergeants but her. She happened to be an African-American, very good sergeant. But today, you have men and women working together, and you cannot have harassment or abuse by either sex towards the other. Now, that's easy for me to say as a 78-year-old, but try to tell that to an 18-year-old, But that's what you got to be, and the commander sets that tone, and it's very important. Now, going forward into deployment, again, some of our best soldiers are women, and they do a great job. So, truck drivers going into combat, and by the way, truck drivers going to combat, even though they're combat service support, they're in combat.
Yeah.
So you got to be cognizant of that. So you got to make sure that you have a healthy environment and that you provide for these folks. And I think that's a challenge of the all-volunteer force. And, I don't know how it's going right now, but I think we're going to meet our goals this year in the Army, our recruiting goals. I think the ROTC, I watched the commissioning ceremony at Notre Dame the other day. We commissioned about 15 or 20 men and women. The Air Force commissioned mostly women. In this, because Notre Dame is a joint ROTC program, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. So it's important that we make a healthy environment for these soldiers. And we treat them as soldiers, and we don't treat them as men and women. We treat them as soldiers. It's a real challenge. And I think the active Army and reserve leaders struggle with this day in and day out. Because, what you say is policy, everybody's got to follow it.
Yeah. So, as you know, the Pritzker Military Museum and Library has a mission to study and collect stories, artifacts related to the citizen soldier. What does the term citizen soldier mean to you?
Well, it means what we've been talking about for the last few hours. It's somebody who has a civilian job and also is in the Reserve or National Guard. Right. And the citizen soldier realizes that he or she is not going to be on active duty full time. Now there are some that are. They're called Army Guard and Reserve, AGRs. They do full-time work. But the citizen soldier realizes that he's going to do a mission or she's going to do a mission, and then they're going to go back to their civilian life. The key to the citizen soldier is the citizen. The family and the business have to support the soldier.
Yeah.
That's what it means to me. I mean, I was a citizen soldier, and my business and my family supported what I was doing. And it's critical that we continue to have a reserve and National Guard in our country.
Are you a member of any veteran organizations?
I'm a member of the VFW post here in North Riverside, Illinois, and I'm a member of the American Legion post at the Union League Club of Chicago. Don't ask me the numbers, but and I'm also a member of the Military Order of the World Wars. And I'm a member, I guess those are the three military organizations that I'm a member of.
What would you like young people and future generations to know about the military?
Oh, I think the military is easy. It's a great way to start. Whether you graduate from high school and go right into the military, or you go on to college and get your ROTC or regular Army commission. As I look back on my career, I was a supervisor in the military. I ran a postal detachment. That got me my first job. It also got me, back in 1968, my wife sent me $100 a month to live on, and I saved my entire military salary. So when I left the military, I had $10,000. And that was my down payment on a $30,000 house. So I put a third down. So I think it's a great way to start. I also think it's a patriotic thing to do. And I know patriotism is kind of, we're all worried about being woke and all this other stuff. But I think it's a way to support your country.
Yeah.
I mean, if you told me I'm going to go into the Peace Corps, I'd say good for you. That's a way to support your country. I think every young man and woman needs to do service to their country. And I don't care whether it's the Peace Corps, the Army, whatever. So
to contribute to.
Contribute, And unfortunately, in my opinion, our children today, and it's probably our fault, they have too much. And they expect too much. But I encourage my grandchildren to give back, and so far, knock on wood, my two oldest ones have. So
that's good. Yeah. General Scully, is there something that you would like to add or talk about that we did not address?
The one thing that I will say is that I feel that the Pritzker Military Library and other organizations that support the military in a scholastic way, other than just VFW American Legion way, is really important. To have a collection of literature and memorabilia available to the military is extremely important. And I am pleased to see that the Association of the U.S. Army recognizes that. And I guess I'm a member of the AUSA and a member of the Military Officers Association as well. I think it's important that people that are retired like me are not afraid to speak up and lobby the Congress. I think that's important. So I think what the military office, what you do at the Pritzker, is very important.
I think so too, and I think it's also nice to have a neutral place of debate, between programs and the library itself and the museum collection.
Yeah, it really is. In fact, I've got to get down there more often. Judy and I do a lot of traveling. I mean, we're probably gone 6 months of the year.
Well, many, many thanks and an appreciation. we'll be sending you a challenge coin in the mail, not quite as dramatic as an in-person.
I'll send you one of mine, Leah.
Okay.
I'll send you one of mine. How's that? We'll exchange challenge coins. Okay?
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
All righty.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.